Chapter 1, The Quiet Realization. Marlin sat at the small dining table that doubled as his workspace, the soft glow of his laptop the only light in the apartment. The overhead lamp remained off, not out of intention, but because he hadn't thought to turn it on. The room had settled into that comfortable dimness of a place waiting for someone else to return. Across from him, Tina's chair sat empty, one of her scarves draped lazily over the back. He glanced at it briefly, then back to the screen. His cursor blinked patiently beneath a single line. "I promise to." Carl leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "Well," he muttered to no one in particular, "that's not intimidating at all." He reached for his glass of water, took a sip, and set it down carefully, as if precise movements might spark clarity. Writing vows should have been easy. He loved Tina. That part wasn't complicated. It wasn't fragile or uncertain. It was steady, reliable, almost expected. He smiled faintly at that thought. "Romantic," he said under his breath. His fingers returned to the keyboard, hovering. He tried again. "I promise to stand beside you." He stopped. Something about the sentence felt incomplete, like it assumed a symmetry that hadn't yet been confirmed. Carl frowned slightly, tapping the backspace key once, twice, until the line disappeared. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped. "Okay," he said quietly. "Don't overthink it. Just honesty." That had always worked for him. His gaze drifted toward the hallway, half expecting to hear the door open, Tina's familiar voice calling out to him. But the apartment remained still. She had texted earlier. "Out with the girls. Don't wait up," he had replied immediately. "Have fun." And he meant it. He always meant it. Still, he glanced at the time on his laptop. 9:47 p.m., "That's normal," he said aloud, nodding once, as if confirming a conclusion in a meeting. "Friday night. Social. Healthy." He returned to the screen. "I promise to build a life with you based on trust, respect." Carl paused again, this time not typing, not deleting, just thinking. Trust. The word settled heavily. He did trust her. There wasn't a question about that. Tina was honest, warm, vibrant in a way that made people lean toward her without realizing it. She didn't hide things. She didn't lie. If anything, she was transparently herself. That was part of what he loved. So why did the word feel insufficient? Carl leaned back again, pressing his palms against his thighs. "No, that's not it," he said, his brow tightening. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, then slowly brought his gaze back down to the blinking cursor. "Think smaller," he said. "Specific promises." He began typing again, slower this time. "I promise to choose you." His fingers froze. The phrase hung there, stark and uncomplicated. "Choose you." Carl sat very still. "Of course I would," he said quietly. "That's the point." But the thought didn't settle as easily this time. His mind moved, not forward, but sideways, away from himself, toward her. Would she? The question didn't come with accusation. It wasn't sharp or angry. It arrived gently, almost curiously, as if it had simply been waiting for the right wording. Carl frowned. "That's not fair," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "You don't just ask that out of nowhere." He rubbed his jaw, then leaned forward again, reading the unfinished line. "I promise to choose you." He tried to finish it. "Every day," he murmured. "In every situation. In every—" He stopped, because suddenly, he realized he didn't know if that promise was mutual in the way he needed it to be. Not in theory. In reality. Carl exhaled slowly, his chest tightening just enough for him to notice. "Tina loves me," he said firmly. "That's not the issue." And it wasn't. He thought about her laugh, the way she filled a room, the way she curled into his side at night without thinking about it. Her affection wasn't conditional. It wasn't withheld. But something else lingered beneath that. Carl tapped his finger lightly against the table. "She just doesn't prioritize the same way," he said. The words settled more cleanly. He thought about the last few weekends, the spontaneous plans, the way she would say, "I'll check with Carl," but rarely did. The way decisions formed around her social circle first, then expanded to include him. It hadn't bothered him at first. It had actually been one of the things he admired, her independence, her full life. But now there was a ring on her finger. Now there was a future being planned. Now the question wasn't whether she loved him. It was whether he was the center of the life she was building. Carl closed his laptop halfway, his reflection faint in the darkened screen. "Am I?" he asked quietly. The apartment didn't answer. He leaned back, crossing his arms, replaying moments in his mind. Not as evidence, but as patterns. If something came up, something important, something that required a choice, would she hesitate? And if she did, would he feel like he had to earn that choice? Carl's jaw tightened slightly. "No," he said. "That's not acceptable." He sat forward again, opening the laptop fully. The cursor blinked, patient as ever. "I promise to choose you." Carl stared at the sentence, then shook his head slowly. "I don't even know if I can write that yet," he admitted. And that was the moment it clicked. Not dramatically, not with a surge of emotion, but with a quiet, undeniable clarity. This wasn't about trust. It was about certainty. He trusted Tina completely, but he wasn't certain of where he stood when it mattered most. Carl rested his elbows on the table, pressing his fingertips together. Talking to her won't fix it, he said. He could already imagine the conversation. She would reassure him. She would say all the right things. She would mean them, but would she have discovered them on her own? Or would he have handed her the answer? Carl exhaled, shaking his head. No, he said again, more firmly this time. That doesn't solve anything. He leaned back thinking. I need to see it, he murmured. Or at least, understand it. His gaze drifted back to the empty chair across from him. Then, slowly, his expression shifted. Not softer, not harder, just more resolved. Not a test, he said quietly. A conversation. With witnesses. People she trusted. People who weren't invested in giving him comfort or avoiding tension. Carl reached for his phone, hesitating only briefly before unlocking it. Her parents. He scrolled to the contact, then paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. This isn't about being right, he reminded himself. It's about knowing. After a moment, he tapped the call button. As the phone rang, Carl glanced once more at the unfinished line glowing on his laptop. I promised to choose you. He let out a slow breath. Let's find out if that goes both ways. The call connected, and with it, something in Carl settled. Not because the answer was clear, but because he had finally decided to ask the right question. Chapter 2, the conversation that changes direction. The dining room at Tina's parents' house was brighter than Carl expected. Not in lighting, but in tone. It had the kind of lived-in warmth that came from years of dinners, conversations, and the quiet assurance that nothing said at that table would be dismissed too quickly. Carl noticed it immediately when he stepped inside, though he didn't comment on it. He simply offered a polite smile as Tina's mother, Diane Carson, greeted them with a soft embrace. It's so good to see you both, Diane said, stepping back to look at them properly. You look settled. Tina laughed lightly, slipping off her coat. That's one word for it. Carl glanced at her briefly, then back at Diane. We appreciate you having us over. Anytime, Diane replied warmly, especially if it involves food. From somewhere deeper in the house, Tina's father, Richard, called out, I heard that, and I completely agree with it. Tina rolled her eyes affectionately. He hasn't even asked what we're having yet. Doesn't matter, Richard said as he stepped into the hallway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. If your mother made it, I already approve. Carl shook his hand firmly. Good to see you again. You too, Carl. Richard's expression softened, assessing but kind. How's work treating you? It's consistent, Carl said, which I've come to appreciate. That's adulthood, Richard said with a small smile. Consistency over excitement. Tina nudged Carl lightly. Don't let him trick you into thinking that's a universal truth. Carl smiled faintly. I'll keep that in mind. Dinner began easily enough. The conversation stayed in familiar territory. Work updates, wedding timelines, minor anecdotes that filled space without demanding too much of anyone. Tina animatedly described a recent outing with her friends, her hands moving as she spoke, her energy bright and effortless. Carl listened, nodding when appropriate, smiling at the right moments. He didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect. But there was a quiet distance in the way he engaged, subtle enough that no one commented on it, though Diane's eyes lingered on him once or twice longer than necessary. It wasn't until plates had been cleared and Diane set down a fresh pot of coffee that Carl shifted slightly in his seat. Actually, he said, his voice calm but deliberate, there was something I was hoping we could talk about tonight. Tina looked at him immediately, her expression curious rather than concerned. Okay, she said lightly. That sounds serious. Not serious, Carl replied. Just important. Richard leaned back, folding his hands together. That's usually the same thing, but go on. Carl gave a brief, polite nod. I wanted to ask if you'd both be willing to share some advice about marriage. Diane's expression brightened. Oh, that's easy enough. Richard chuckled. Careful. You might get more than you asked for. I was hoping for that, Carl said. Tina glanced between them. You couldn't have just Googled this? Carl smiled faintly. I trust this source more. That's flattering, Diane said gently. What specifically are you looking for? Carl paused just long enough to gather his thoughts, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. I've been working on my vows, he said, and I realized that promises sound very simple until you really think about what they mean in practice. Tina tilted her head slightly. Okay. One of the ideas that keeps coming up, Carl continued, is the concept of choosing your partner, not just once but consistently, in different situations under different pressures. Richard nodded slowly. That's fair. Carl glanced at Tina briefly, then back to her parents. And I guess I've been trying to understand what that actually looks like. Not in theory, but in reality. Diane rested her hands around her coffee cup. Meaning, Carl's tone remained steady. Meaning, how you balance everything else in your life against that commitment. Friends, family, obligations. There are always going to be competing priorities. Tina shifted slightly in her seat now, the first hint of tension entering her posture. So you're asking how we did that? She asked. Yes, Carl said. And also, how you knew you were doing it right. Richard let out a quiet breath, considering the question. You don't always know in advance, he admitted. Sometimes you find out after you've made the choice. Diane nodded. But the important part is that the choice becomes instinctive over time. You don't weigh it the same way anymore. Your partnership becomes the baseline. Carl absorbed that, nodding once. That makes sense, he said. Tina looked at him, her brow faintly furrowed. Where is this coming from? Carl met her gaze, not evasive, not confrontational. From realizing I don't want to make promises I'm not certain I understand, he said. Her expression softened slightly, but the tension didn't disappear. Okay, she said slowly. Carl inhaled quietly, then leaned forward just enough to signal that what he was about to say mattered. I trust you, he said, his voice even. Completely. That's not part of this. Tina's shoulders relaxed a fraction, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. But I'm not sure, he continued, that I understand where I stand when your priorities conflict. The room grew still, not dramatically but noticeably. Even the soft ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder. Tina blinked. What does that mean? Carl didn't rush to answer. It means, he said carefully, that if something came up, something that required you to choose between me and something else in your life, I'm not certain which way that would go. Tina sat back slightly, her expression shifting from confusion to something more unsettled. Carl, she said, a nervous laugh escaping. That's kind of a weird question. I know, he said calmly. It's not an easy one. Why would I have to choose like that? She asked. Because situations like that happen, Carl replied. Not constantly, not dramatically, but they do exist. Diane and Richard remained quiet, watching the exchange without interruption. Tina shook her head slightly. I mean, of course I would choose you. Carl didn't nod right away. He held her gaze, his expression steady but searching. Would you? He asked, not sharply, but without softening the question. Tina's confidence faltered, just enough to be visible. Yeah, she said again, though quieter this time. I mean, I love you. That's the whole point. I know you do, Carl said. That's not what I'm questioning. Then what are you questioning? She asked, her voice tightening. Carl exhaled slowly, keeping his tone level. I'm questioning whether that choice is instinctive for you yet, or if it's something you arrive at after considering everything else. Tina opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. The pause that followed stretched longer than anyone expected. Richard shifted slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than critical. Diane tilted her head, watching her daughter closely. Take your time, she said gently. Tina looked down at her hands, then back up at Carl. I haven't thought about it like that before, she admitted. Carl nodded once. I didn't think you had. Her brows drew together. That doesn't mean I wouldn't choose you. I'm not saying you wouldn't, Carl said. I'm saying I don't know that you've had to consider it. And that's a problem? She asked. For me it is, he said quietly. Because I need to know what we're building is something we both prioritize the same way. Tina leaned back, her expression unsettled in a way that wasn't defensive, but searching. She started, then stopped again. I've never seen it as a competition. Carl's voice softened slightly. Neither have I. But if there's ever a moment where it feels like one, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I need to know I'm not competing. The statement didn't land like an accusation. It landed like a truth he had taken time to understand. Tina absorbed it, her expression shifting. Not toward anger, but toward something quieter, more introspective. I don't know why that question feels harder than I thought it would, she admitted, her voice lower now. Diane spoke gently. Because it's not a question about love. It's a question about behavior. Richard nodded. And behavior is built on habits. Tina looked between them, then back at Carl. I love you, she said again, more firmly this time. I know you do, Carl replied. But, she hesitated. I guess I haven't really changed anything since we got engaged. Carl didn't interrupt. I just assumed it would happen naturally, she continued. That things would shift over time. That's what I thought too, Carl said. Their eyes met, and for the first time that evening, the tension between them felt less like a fracture and more like a shared realization. Tina exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. That's kind of unsettling, she admitted. Richard offered a small, understanding smile. Growth usually is. The room fell into a quieter silence, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. Carl didn't push further. He didn't need to. The question had been asked, and more importantly, it had been felt. Tina stared down at the table for a moment longer, then looked up again, her expression different now. Not resolved, but aware. I think I need to think about that, she said. Carl nodded. That's all I was hoping for. And in that moment, nothing was fixed. But something had undeniably begun. Chapter 3, The Weight of Reflection. The apartment felt different the following morning, though Carl couldn't immediately define how. Nothing had physically changed. The same couch sat angled toward the television. The same half-empty mug rested beside the sink. The same scarf still hung over the chair where Tina had left it the night before. But something quieter had shifted, something that lived in the pauses between words. Tina moved through the space more slowly than usual. Not dramatically slower, just enough that Carl noticed when she stood at the kitchen counter a few seconds longer than necessary, or when she opened her phone, stared at it, and then set it back down without typing. Carl stayed out of her way, not deliberately, but with awareness. He poured himself coffee, nodded when she glanced over, and returned to reviewing emails on his laptop as if the rhythm of normalcy might give her room. It wasn't avoidance. It was space. After a while, Tina spoke. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked, her voice casual, though it carried a faint hesitation. Carl looked up. "Yeah," he said. "You?" She gave a tiny shrug. "Eventually." There was a pause. Carl nodded once, not pressing. Tina leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. She watched him for a moment, as though measuring whether to continue. "I kept replaying last night," she said finally. Carl closed his laptop halfway, signaling his attention. "Okay. I didn't realize how unprepared I'd be for that question," she admitted. Carl's expression remained calm. "That wasn't the goal." "I know," she said quickly. "You weren't trying to corner me." "No," he said. "I wasn't." She exhaled softly, rubbing her arm. "That almost makes it worse." Carl tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because you weren't exaggerating," she said. "You weren't emotional. You were just stating something you'd already thought through." Carl considered that for a moment. "I tried to be fair." Tina nodded slowly. "You were." The room settled again, the quiet stretching. Not uncomfortable, but heavy with things still forming. She pushed herself off the counter and walked toward the table, pulling out the chair across from him. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she rested her hands on the back of it, looking down. "I've been thinking about what you said," she continued. "About instinct." Carl didn't interrupt. "I always believed that if it mattered enough, I would make the right choice," she said. "That it would sort itself out." "That's not unreasonable," Carl said. "It feels a little naive now," she replied, offering a faint, self-conscious smile. "Like I assumed I'd just rise to the occasion." Carl leaned back slightly in his chair. "Most people do." Tina finally sat down, her posture less guarded now, though still thoughtful. "I tried to answer your question this morning," she said. "I actually sat on the couch and said it out loud." Carl raised an eyebrow slightly. "What did you say?" She exhaled through her nose, a small, almost embarrassed sound. "It took me longer than I expected." Carl didn't react immediately, letting the admission settle. "That's what bothered me," she added quickly. "Not that I had to think, but how long I had to think." "About choosing me?" Carl asked gently. "About choosing anything that felt like a conflict," she corrected. "Because I realized I don't usually see my life that way." Carl nodded once. "Explain that." Tina leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "I've always just done things," she said. "If my friends made plans, I went. If something came up, I decided in the moment. I never really prioritized in a structured way." "You didn't need to," Carl said. "Exactly," she replied. "Nothing required it before." Her gaze met his, steady now. "But now something does." Carl held her gaze, his expression thoughtful but open. "I think that's what you were pointing out," she said. "It is," he answered. She nodded slowly. "I didn't ignore you," she continued. "That part matters to me. I never thought of you as optional." "I know," Carl said simply. "But I also didn't center us," she admitted. The honesty in the statement landed cleanly, without defensiveness. Carl rested his hands on the table. "That's the part I've been trying to understand." Tina glanced down briefly, then back up again. "I think I believed that commitment would change how I felt," she said. "But not necessarily how I acted." Carl considered that. "And now I realize it has to change both," she said. There was no dramatic shift in her tone, no surge of conviction, just clarity, still settling into place. Carl nodded slowly. "That's a fair conclusion." Tina gave a small half-smile. "It's also a little overwhelming." "Why?" "Because I have to look at everything I've been doing and ask if it still makes sense," she said. "And I don't love that answer for some of it." Carl tilted his head slightly. "That doesn't mean it was wrong before." "I know," she said. "But it might be wrong now." The distinction hung between them, simple but significant. Carl leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. "I'm not asking you to give up your friends," he said. "I know you're not," she replied quickly. "That's actually what makes this harder." He gave a faint smile. "How so?" "Because if you were, I could just argue with you," she said. "Or push back. Or tell you you're being unreasonable." Carl let out a quiet breath of amusement. "And I'm not giving you that option." "Not even a little," she said, shaking her head. They both smiled, briefly, the tension easing just enough to let something lighter in. Then Tina grew thoughtful again. I think I've been living like everything can coexist without adjustment, she said. Like I can keep everything at the same level and nothing will conflict. Carl nodded. And now you're realizing that's not always true. Yeah, she said. And I don't actually know what it looks like to change that yet. Carl watched her carefully. That's okay, he said. I don't need you to have it figured out right away. Tina shifted in her seat. But you need to see that I'm figuring it out. Carl didn't answer immediately. Yes, he said after a moment. The honesty was quiet, but firm. Tina absorbed it, her expression softening again. Not with relief, but with understanding. Okay, she said. That's fair. They sat in silence for a few seconds, the kind that no longer felt uncertain, just reflective. Then Tina reached for her phone again, this time unlocking it with purpose. She scrolled briefly, then stopped. Carl watched but didn't ask. After a moment, she set the phone down again. I had plans tonight, she said. Carl raised his eyes. With your friends? Yeah, she said. Nothing big, just drinks. He nodded once. Okay. She hesitated, then added, I don't think I'm going to go. Carl studied her expression carefully. Why not? He asked, not challenging, just curious. Tina met his gaze. Because I want to be here, she said. The answer didn't carry weight in the way she might have expected. It wasn't presented like a declaration or a gesture meant to prove something. It sounded deliberate. Carl considered it for a moment. You don't have to cancel your plans because of what we talked about, he said. I know, she replied. That's why it matters that I'm choosing to. Carl held her gaze, searching not for correctness, but for intention. And if I told you to go? He asked. Tina tilted her head slightly, considering. I'd still stay, she said after a moment. Not because you asked me to, but because I already decided. Carl leaned back slowly, letting that settle. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't proof. But it was something different, something intentional. He nodded once. Okay, he said. Tina exhaled softly, a small release of tension leaving her shoulders. This is going to take time, isn't it? She asked. Carl allowed himself a faint smile. Yeah, he said. It probably will. She nodded, not discouraged, just aware. Then I guess we start here. Carl glanced briefly at his laptop, still open to the unfinished vows, then back at her. Yes, he said. We do. And for the first time since the question had been asked, the future didn't feel uncertain. Felt under construction. Chapter for Shifting Priorities. By midweek, the changes Tina had decided to make no longer lived safely in her thoughts. They were beginning to show in the small, observable patterns of her day. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden declarations or sweeping gestures. If anything, the differences were almost unremarkable to anyone who wasn't looking closely. Carl noticed, though. He noticed when she asked him Tuesday evening, do you want to plan dinner for the rest of the week? Instead of deciding at 6:30 that she felt like going out. He noticed when she paused before accepting a call, glancing at him as though weighing something she hadn't weighed before. And he noticed something else, too. She looked focused. Not tense, not defensive, just attentive in a way that hadn't previously been required of her. Thursday night, that shift became harder to ignore. Carl sat on the couch reviewing something on his tablet when Tina walked in from the bedroom, already dressed, her hair pinned back just enough to suggest she had put thought into it. You heading out? He asked, looking up. She hesitated in the doorway for a fraction of a second before answering. Maybe. Carl's brow lifted slightly. That doesn't sound very decided. It's not, she admitted, stepping closer. I told them I'd go tonight. I just haven't confirmed yet. Carl set the tablet aside, resting his arm along the back of the couch. Okay. She lingered near the coffee table, not sitting, not standing still either. Her hands moved slightly, adjusting the bracelet on her wrist, then smoothing the fabric of her sleeve. They're all going out, she said. Same place as last week. Carl nodded. You usually enjoy that. I do, she said quickly. Then softer. I did. The correction was subtle, but not insignificant. Carl watched her carefully. What's making you hesitate? Tina let out a breath, then dropped onto the couch beside him. Though she didn't lean back, she sat upright, as if ready to stand again at any moment. I've been thinking about what we talked about, she said. I figured, Carl replied. And it's not just in big, hypothetical scenarios, she continued. It's in these normal moments. Carl nodded once. That's where it actually matters. She glanced at him, a faint smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. That's exactly what I've been realizing. It's not about one dramatic choice. It's about 100 small ones that add up. Carl didn't interrupt. Tina looked down at her hands. Before, I didn't even question it. If something sounded fun, I went. If it didn't conflict with anything obvious, I said yes. And now? He asked gently. Now it feels like there's something else to consider first, she said. What is that? He asked. She turned toward him fully, her expression thoughtful. You, she said simply. Carl held her gaze, not reacting immediately, as though testing the weight of the word. And what does that consideration look like? He asked. Tina exhaled softly. That's the part I'm still figuring out. There was no defensiveness in her voice, just honesty. I don't want it to feel like I need permission, she added quickly. That's not what this is. I wouldn't want that either, Carl said. I know, she replied, which makes it harder to define. She leaned back slightly now, finally allowing herself to settle into the couch. I think, she paused, searching. I think it's about whether I'm making decisions as if we're building something together, or like I'm still just managing my own life and inviting you along when it works. Carl absorbed that quietly. That's a clear distinction, he said. It is now, she replied. It wasn't before. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that felt less uncertain and more contemplative. Then Tina reached for her phone. Unlocking it, Carl watched without asking. She opened a message thread, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. They're already there, she said. They're expecting me. Carl nodded once. If you want to go, you should. Tina looked at him sharply, not suspiciously, but as if trying to measure something beneath the surface. Do you mean that? She asked. Yes, he said. This isn't about me restricting you. It's about you deciding what matters. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at her phone. I think that's the part I'm struggling with, she admitted. What part? Recognizing that deciding what matters might mean changing what I'm used to, she said. Carl gave a small nod. That's usually how it works. She let out a quiet laugh, though there was little humor in it. I always thought change would feel like improvement, she said. And now it just feels uncomfortable, she replied. Carl allowed himself a faint smile. That's not a sign you're doing it wrong. Tina glanced at him. It's not. No, he said. It's usually a sign you're paying attention. That lingered for a moment before she nodded slowly. She looked back at her phone again, then typed something deliberately, each word entered with care. Carl didn't ask what she wrote. After a few seconds, she hit send. Then she set the phone down on the table, face down this time. I told them I'm not coming, she said. Carl tilted his head slightly. Because of me? She shook her head immediately. No. A small pause followed before she added. Because I want to spend the night here, intentionally. Not just because nothing else is happening, but because I chose it. Carl studied her expression carefully. Okay, he said after a moment. The word carried no judgment, no approval, just acknowledgement. Tina leaned back fully now, her shoulders dropping slightly as if something within her had settled, even if only partially. That felt heavier than it should have, she admitted. It won't always, Carl said. She turned her head toward him. You're very calm about all of this. Carl considered that. I've had more time to think about it. Tina nodded. That makes sense. Another moment of quiet passed. Then Tina spoke again, her tone shifting just slightly. They're going to notice, she said. Carl raised an eyebrow. Your friends. Yeah, she replied. They're used to me showing up, saying yes, being available. And now you might not be, Carl said. She nodded slowly. Not in the same way. Carl watched her, his expression thoughtful but steady. Do you think they'll understand? He asked. Tina hesitated. I think some of them will, she said. And some of them won't, at least not right away. And how does that feel? He asked. She gave a small, honest shrug. Uncomfortable. Carl smiled faintly. That word again. Yeah, she said. It's becoming a theme. He shifted slightly on the couch, turning a bit more toward her. You don't have to figure all of that out at once, he said. I know, she replied. But I do have to start somewhere. Carl nodded. That's fair. Tina looked around the apartment for a moment. The quiet, the stillness, the absence of noise she had once filled without thinking. It's strange, she said. Nothing about this feels dramatic, but it feels important. That's because it is, Carl said. She smiled faintly at that, then leaned her head back. Do you feel different? She asked suddenly. Carl considered the question carefully. A little, he said. In what way? I feel like we're both paying attention now, he replied. Tina turned her head toward him, studying his expression. And that's good? She asked. Yes, Carl said. It's where we needed to be. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Okay, she said. They fell into a quieter rhythm after that. Not forced, not uncertain, just present. Later, as the night settled in, Tina's phone buzzed once on the table. She glanced at it but didn't immediately reach for it. Carl noticed but said nothing. After a few seconds, she picked it up, read the message, then set it back down again without replying. Everything okay? He asked. She nodded. Yeah, just questions. Carl smiled faintly. That's fair. Tina exhaled softly, then shifted closer to him on the couch, not dramatically, just enough to close the space between them. For the first time, the decision didn't feel like something she was measuring. It felt like something she had already made. And though nothing had been resolved fully, and nothing had become effortless yet, the direction, at last, felt clear. Chapter 5, Honest Friction. The first real disagreement didn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic tension. It began, as most of their recent changes did, in something small. Saturday morning unfolded quietly. Carl sat at the table with his laptop open, scrolling through a document he had already read twice, more out of habit than necessity. Tina moved in and out of the room, tidying without urgency. The soft sounds of drawers opening and closing filling the space between them felt normal. Not strained, not distant, just careful. Tina eventually wandered back into the kitchen, a mug of coffee in both hands this time. She set one in front of Carl without a word, then leaned against the counter. "Thank you," he said, glancing up. "You're welcome." She didn't sit right away. Instead, she watched him for a moment, as if waiting for something she couldn't quite name. "Do you have plans today?" she asked. Carl shook his head slightly. "Not really. I figured we'd decide together." Tina nodded once. "Okay." Pause followed. "Why?" he asked. She shifted her weight, one hand tightening slightly around her mug. "Because I kind of do," she said. Carl set his laptop aside, giving her his full attention. "What's going on?" he asked. Tina hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she clearly understood the context in which it now existed. "They're doing brunch," she said. "Same group as usual. It came up last night." Carl nodded once. "Okay." He didn't say anything else right away, and for a moment, that silence felt heavier than it should have. Tina noticed. "You don't sound thrilled," she said. Carl leaned back slightly, considering his response. "I'm not unthrilled," he said carefully. "I'm just thinking about it." "That's exactly what I mean," she said, a faint edge slipping into her tone. "You never used to think about it this much." Carl's expression stayed calm. "Neither did you." "That's the point," she replied. "It wasn't a problem before." Carl tilted his head slightly. "It wasn't visible before." Tina exhaled slowly, setting her mug down a little harder than intended. "So now it's a problem every time I make plans?" she asked. "No," he said immediately. "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" she pressed. Carl rested his hands on the table, his voice measured. "I'm saying that now, when you make plans, it means something different," he replied. Tina crossed her arms, her posture tightening. "Different how?" she asked. "Because we're building something that requires coordination," he said. "Shared decisions, intentional time." She let out a short breath. "I'm not disappearing for a week, Carl. It's brunch." "I know," he said evenly. "Then why does it feel like I'm doing something wrong?" she asked. The question landed sharper than anything she had said so far. Carl paused, watching her carefully. "I haven't said you're doing anything wrong," he replied. "You don't have to," she said. "The way you react, the way I pause?" he interrupted, still calm. "The way I think before I respond?" "Yes," she said, frustration flickering. "It makes everything feel evaluated." Carl leaned back slightly, considering her words. "That's not my intention," he said. "I know it's not," she replied quickly. "But that's how it feels." The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence carried weight. Carl spoke first. "Do you want me to react differently?" he asked. Tina hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. I don't want this to turn into something where I have to justify wanting to see my friends." "You don't have to justify it," Carl said. "Then why does it feel like I do?" Carl exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "Because we're both paying attention now," he said. "And attention can feel like pressure until we understand it." Tina stared at him for a moment, her frustration not disappearing, but shifting. "I feel like I'm suddenly getting it wrong," she said. "You're not," he replied. "Then why does it feel like I am?" she repeated, softer this time. Carl didn't answer immediately. "Because you're changing how you think about things," he said after a moment. "And that process doesn't feel smooth." Tina let out a breath, her shoulders dropping slightly. "This isn't what I expected," she admitted. "Neither did I," Carl said. Another pause. Then Tina moved, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down, her expression less defensive now, but still unsettled. "I don't want to feel like I'm choosing between you and my friends every time something comes up," she said. Carl nodded. "Neither do I. But that's what this feels like right now," she continued. "Like every decision has this underlying weight." Carl leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "That's because we haven't figured out the balance yet," he said. Tina looked down at her hands. "I don't know what that balance looks like." "Neither do I," Carl admitted. She glanced up at him, surprised. "You don't?" "No," he said. "What I do know is that I don't want to feel like I'm competing for your time by default." Tina's expression shifted again, something quieter replacing the frustration. "I never thought of it that way," she said. "I know," he replied. "But it's not a competition to me," she insisted. Carl nodded slowly. "I believe that." "Then why do you feel like it is?" she asked. He considered the question carefully. "Because your default has always been to say yes to them first," he said. "And then fit me in after." Tina opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. The truth of it wasn't loud, but it was clear. I didn't realize that's how it looked, she said quietly. It didn't look like anything before, Carl said. It just was. But now it does, she murmured. Yes. She leaned back slightly, processing. That's not how I wanted to feel, she said. I know, he replied. Tina exhaled deeply, brushing a hand through her hair. Okay, she said after a moment. Let me try to explain what's happening on my side. Carl nodded. I'm listening. She took a second before speaking again. When I got invited to brunch, my first thought wasn't that it conflicted with anything, she said. It was just something I wanted to do. That makes sense, Carl said. But then I thought about you, she continued. And not in a should I ask permission way, but in a how does this fit with us way. Carl didn't interrupt. And instead of feeling clear, it made everything feel heavier, she said. Like I suddenly needed to account for something I've never had to account for before. Carl nodded slowly. That's the adjustment. Tina met his gaze. I don't want to go back to not thinking about it, she said. But I also don't want to feel stuck every time I make a decision. You won't, he said. Not forever. She gave a small, tired smile. You're very confident about that. I've seen enough to know that clarity comes with practice, he replied. Tina tilted her head slightly. Practice at what? At deciding intentionally, Carl said. She considered that. Okay, she said slowly. Then let me try to do that right now. Carl waited. Tina looked at her phone, then back at him. I want to go to brunch, she said. Carl nodded once. But I also want to make sure that we're not just defaulting into separate lives, she added. Carl's expression softened slightly. So what does that look like? She thought for a moment. I go to brunch, she said. But we actually plan the rest of the day together. Not loosely. Intentionally. Carl considered it, then nodded. That works for me, he said. Tina studied his face, looking for hesitation, doubt, anything. That's it? She asked. That's it, he said. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, some of the tension easing out of her posture. I thought this was going to turn into a bigger argument, she admitted. Carl allowed a faint smile. It almost did. Tina let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, it kind of did. They sat in the aftermath of it. Not damaged, not distant, but clearer. This is new territory, she said. It is, he agreed. Tina picked up her phone again, typing quickly this time. Carl watched her, not out of concern, but curiosity. After a moment, she looked up. I told them I'll be there, she said. And that I'm leaving by 1. Carl nodded. Okay. She hesitated, then added. And then the rest of the day is ours. Carl met her gaze. Not because I insisted, he said. Not because you insisted, she confirmed. Because I decided that's what I want. Carl leaned back slowly, letting that settle. Good, he said. Tina smiled faintly, the tension finally dissolving into something steadier. This hadn't been a perfect conversation. Hadn't been easy, but it had been honest. And for the first time, both of them could feel it. They weren't just avoiding conflict anymore. They were learning how to move through it. Chapter 6, Redefining Partnership. The next changes didn't announce themselves. There was no clear line Tina crossed, no single decision that marked a transformation. Instead, things began to take shape in the spaces between habits, quiet adjustments that, over time, created something sturdier than either of them expected. It started with Sunday evening. They sat at the table again, but this time neither of them pretended it was just a place to eat or work. Tina had brought her laptop, Carl had his calendar open, and for a few moments they simply looked at each other, both aware that this wasn't something either of them had done intentionally before. So, Tina said lightly, though there was purpose beneath it, what does planning together actually look like? Carl smiled faintly. I was hoping you'd have an answer. She shook her head. No, I've just been thinking about it. And now I realize I've never actually done it this way. Carl tapped his screen lightly. We don't need to overcomplicate it. That sounds like a plan you've already thought through, she said, raising an eyebrow. I have a preference, he admitted. Of course you do, she said, smiling. Carl leaned forward slightly. I think we start with anchoring time, he said. Things that are consistent, non-negotiable unless something serious comes up. Tina tilted her head. Like routines? Yes, Carl replied. Not rigid ones, just intentional ones. She considered that for a moment. Okay, she said. What would that be for us? Carl hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of care. Dinner together during the week, he said. Not every night, but most. And something on the weekends. Not necessarily big, just ours. Tina nodded slowly, absorbing it. That doesn't sound restrictive, she said. It sounds grounding. That's the idea, Carl replied. She glanced down at her screen, then back up. And everything else fits around that? She asked. Carl shook his head. Not fits around. Balances with. She smiled faintly. You're very particular with wording. It matters, he said. I'm starting to see that, she admitted. Tina leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other. Okay, she said. Then I'll add something. Carl gestured for her to continue. I don't want to lose spontaneity completely, she said. I like that part of my life. It makes things feel alive. Carl nodded. I don't want you to lose that either. But, she continued, I want that spontaneity to include you more intentionally. Carl studied her expression. What does that look like to you? She smiled slightly, as though the answer had only recently formed. It means I don't just say yes to something and then tell you after, she said. It means I pause long enough to ask. Does this include us? Or does it pull me away from us? Carl nodded slowly. That's a meaningful distinction. It is, she said. And I missed it before. There was no guilt in her tone, just recognition. They worked through the rest of the week like that, not rigidly scheduling every hour, but identifying patterns. Tuesday evenings became theirs. Saturdays stayed flexible, but with a conversation instead of an assumption. Friday nights shifted from default social obligations to something intentional, whether that meant staying in or making plans together. It wasn't perfect. On Wednesday, Tina caught herself almost saying yes to an after-work plan out of pure reflex. She stopped mid-sentence, visibly recalibrated, then responded more thoughtfully. Carl noticed. He didn't comment on it immediately, but later that evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, he spoke. You paused today, he said, handing her a plate. Tina glanced at him. You noticed that? I did, he replied. She smiled faintly. It felt weird. In a bad way? He asked. In a new way, she said. Like I was interrupting an old version of myself. Carl nodded, considering that. And what did you decide? He asked. She rinsed the plate before answering. That I didn't actually want to go, she said. I just didn't know that until I stopped long enough to think about it. Carl leaned against the counter. That's important, he said. She looked at him, curiosity flickering. Why? She asked. Because it means your decisions aren't just changing for me, he said. They're becoming clearer for you. Tina held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. I didn't expect that part, she admitted. Most people don't, Carl replied. The changes extended beyond scheduling. It was in the way Tina began including him, not out of obligation but out of instinct that was starting to shift. Thursday evening, she sat beside him on the couch, scrolling through something on her phone. Look at this, she said, angling the screen toward him. Carl leaned in slightly. What is it? A pottery class, she said. Weekend thing. A few sessions. Carl raised an eyebrow. That's new. I know, she said. I thought it might be interesting. Do you want to do it? He asked. She hesitated, then smiled. I want us to consider doing it. Carl studied her, the phrasing not lost on him. That's different, he said. I'm trying, she replied lightly. He looked back at the screen, then at her. Okay, he said. Let's consider it. The conversation that followed wasn't rushed. They talked about schedules, interest, whether it would feel like something they'd both enjoy or something one of them would tolerate. It wasn't complicated. It was shared. Later that night, as they settled into bed, Tina shifted slightly closer to him, resting her head against his shoulder. This feels different, she said quietly. Carl glanced down at her. In what way? It feels like we're building something on purpose, she replied. Carl let that sit for a moment before answering. I think we finally are. Tina traced a small pattern against his arm absent-mindedly. I used to think independence meant keeping everything separate, she said. Carl's brow furrowed slightly. And now I think it means choosing what you bring together, she said. He considered that, then nodded. That's a better definition, he said. She smiled against his shoulder. I'm still figuring it out, she admitted. You will be, he replied. She tilted her head up slightly, meeting his eyes. Are you? She asked. Carl hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted to answer it clearly. I'm figuring out how to trust what I see, he said. Tina studied him. Meaning I don't want to rush to conclusions, good or bad, he said. I want to let what we're doing speak for itself. She nodded slowly. That's fair, she said. There was no tension in the space between them now. Not because everything had been resolved, but because both of them were moving with intention instead of assumption. The following morning, Tina's phone buzzed again with a familiar name flashing across the screen. She glanced at it, then at Carl, who was sitting at the table finishing his coffee. Hey, she said, walking over. They're planning something for tonight. Carl didn't react immediately. He simply looked at her, giving her the space she now expected. Tina glanced back at her phone, then up again. I'm going to talk to you about it before I answer, she said. Carl leaned back slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting. Good, he said. She smiled in return, not because it was easy yet, but because it felt right. And this time, the decision didn't feel like a conflict waiting to happen. It felt like something they would decide together. Chapter 7, Choosing on Purpose. The moment didn't arrive with warning. There was no tension in the air that morning, no lingering sense that anything significant was approaching. If anything, the day began with an unfamiliar lightness, something that had slowly taken root over the past couple of weeks. Carl stood at the counter pouring coffee, while Tina sat at the table scrolling through something on her tablet, her posture relaxed, her expression quieter than it used to be, but not dimmed. If anything, it felt more grounded. "Do we have anything set for today?" she asked without looking up. Carl shook his head. "Not set. I thought we could decide after breakfast." Tina nodded. "Okay." That would have been the end of it once. A loose plan, easily reshaped by whatever came up next. But now, the pause that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant. Tina looked up. "I kinda wanna go to that market we talked about," she said. "The one near the river." Carl leaned against the counter. "That sounds good. It's supposed to be sunny for once," she added. "We should take advantage of that." Carl smiled faintly. "Agreed." She returned to her tablet briefly, then set it aside, reaching for her coffee. For a few minutes, nothing interrupted the quiet rhythm of the morning, until her phone buzzed. Tina glanced at it casually at first. Then she paused. Carl noticed, not because she reacted quickly, but because she didn't. "Everything okay?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed on the screen, her expression shifting. Not dramatically, but enough for Carl to register that something had changed. "It's Jen," she said after a moment. Carl nodded once. "Okay." Tina tapped the screen, reading further. "They're doing a day trip," she added. "Beach about an hour out. They're leaving soon." Carl didn't speak right away. That wasn't new. Plans like that had been part of Tina's life for years. Spontaneous, easy, assumed. But something about the way she was holding her phone now felt different. Not conflicted, considered. "They want me to come," she said, looking up at him. Carl met her gaze steady. "Do you want to?" he asked. Tina didn't answer immediately. That pause, that small, deliberate space, felt larger than anything that had come before it. In the past, her response would have been automatic. "Yes," followed by quick logistics and a casual "is that okay?" tossed in afterward. Now she leaned back slightly in her chair. "I do," she said slowly. "It sounds fun." Carl nodded once. Then she continued. "But," she exhaled softly, "this is exactly what we've been talking about, isn't it?" Carl didn't look away. "Yes," he said. Tina glanced down at the table, then back at her phone, then finally at Carl again. "They're leaving in half an hour," she said. "If I go, it's basically the whole day." Carl remained still, watching her, not analyzing, not prompting, just present. "And we just made plans," she added, almost thinking aloud. "Not set in stone, but we talked about it." Carl nodded. "We did." Tina pressed her lips together slightly, considering. "I don't want this to feel like a test," she said suddenly. "It's not," Carl replied evenly. "I know," she said, "but it kind of is, in a way. For me." Carl let out a quiet breath. "That's fair," he said. Tina looked at him carefully. "Don't tell me what you want me to do," she said. "I wasn't planning to," he replied. "I mean it," she added more firmly. "I need this to be my decision. Not influenced, not guided." Carl nodded once. "Then I won't say anything." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was deliberate. Tina looked down at her phone again, reading the message one more time. A second notification appeared. Another message, probably a follow-up. "We're leaving soon. Hurry if you're coming." She stared at it. Then she set the phone down. Not dramatically, just decisively. Carl watched but didn't react. Tina leaned back, exhaling. "That would have been automatic before," she said quietly. Carl didn't respond, giving her space to continue. "I would have texted back on my way without even thinking about today," she said. "About you. About us." Carl's expression softened slightly, but he remained silent. Tina shook her head faintly. "And I wouldn't have thought that was wrong," she added. "I would have just called it normal." She looked up at him now, her gaze steady. "But it's not what I want anymore." Carl held her eyes, something careful and attentive in his expression. "Why not?" he asked. The question wasn't a challenge. It was an invitation. Tina didn't hesitate this time. "Because I don't want you to feel like you're secondary to whatever comes up first," she said. Carl's breath shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. "And more importantly," she continued, "I don't want to feel like that's true, even if I don't mean for it to be." The room stayed quiet. Tina reached for her phone again, picking it up slowly. "They're going to question it," she said. "They already are." Carl gave a faint, understanding smile. "That's expected." Tina huffed softly. "Yeah, I can already hear Jen saying I'm disappearing." Carl tilted his head slightly. "Are you?" Tina met his gaze. "No," she said firmly. "I'm just changing." Carl nodded once. Tina looked back at her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then she began to type. Carl didn't ask what she was writing. He didn't need to. After a few seconds, she hit send. Then she set the phone down again. "They'll survive without me," she said quietly. Carl allowed himself a small smile. I believe that, he said. Tina smiled back, but there was something deeper in it now. Something steady. I'm staying, she added. Not because you didn't tell me to go. Not because I feel like I should. Carl leaned back slightly, still watching her. But because this matters more to me right now, she finished. The words didn't feel heavy. They felt clear. Carl nodded slowly. Okay, he said. There was no celebration in the moment. No visible shift. No sudden flood of reassurance. Just recognition. Tina leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. That actually felt simpler than I expected, she admitted. Carl raised an eyebrow faintly. Did it? Yeah, she said. Once I stopped thinking about what I was giving up and started thinking about what I was choosing. Carl let that settle, then gave a small nod. That's the difference, he said. Tina's phone buzzed again, lighting up briefly on the table. This time she didn't reach for it at all. Instead, she stood, walking over to where Carl was now finishing his coffee. So, she said, a hint of lightness returning to her voice, are we still going to that market? Carl looked up at her. Yes, he said. We are. She extended her hand toward him, not casually but deliberately. Then let's go, she said. Carl set his mug aside and took her hand. And in that moment, there was no question left unspoken. No uncertainty waiting beneath the surface. Just two people moving forward, not because nothing else existed, but because they had chosen, together, what mattered most. Chapter 8, The Vow That Fits. The apartment was quiet again, but it no longer felt like waiting. Carl noticed that first. He stood at the same table where everything had begun. The same chair, the same soft light cast by the lamp overhead this time instead of left off by habit. The scarf Tina once left draped over the chair had been folded neatly and placed on the armrest. Not hidden. Not removed. Just intentional. He opened his laptop, the document already waiting for him. The cursor blinked beneath the line he hadn't touched in weeks. I promise to choose you. Carl leaned back, studying the words with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The hesitation that once lived behind them had dissolved, not because the promise had changed, but because the understanding behind it had. He rested his hands on the table, relaxed. Okay, he said quietly. Now it fits. Behind him, the bedroom door opened. You talking to yourself again? Tina's voice carried through lightly. Carl smiled faintly without turning. Only when it helps. She stepped into the room, her expression soft but alert, as though she had learned to notice the same subtle shifts he had. You're working on the vows? She asked. I am. Tina walked over, leaning slightly against the back of the chair across from him, the one she had once left empty so often without noticing. Are they less intimidating now? She asked. Carl glanced up at her. They're clearer. She smiled. That's better than less intimidating. It is, he agreed. She pulled the chair out and sat down across from him, mirroring a position that had once symbolized absence but now felt deliberate. Can I hear part of it? She asked. Carl hesitated, not because he didn't want to share, but because he wanted to say it right. Then he nodded. Yeah, he said. You can. He glanced at the screen again, then back at her, choosing not to read directly from it. I promise to choose you, he began, his voice steady. Not as a reaction to anything else, but as the foundation of everything else. Tina's expression shifted, subtle, but attentive. I promise to build a life where that choice isn't something we revisit in uncertainty, he continued, but something we reinforce in what we do every day. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes staying on his. I promise to be consistent in the way I show up for you, Carl said. Not perfect, but intentional. Not assumed, but given. Tina let out a quiet breath, one she hadn't realized she was holding. Carl paused, then added, and I promise not to expect you to understand what matters to me without making the effort to understand what matters to you. The words landed with equal weight on both sides. Tina nodded slowly, her gaze steady but softer now. That sounds like you, she said quietly. Carl allowed a small smile. That's the goal. There was a pause. Then Tina leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. Not defensively, but thoughtfully. I've been thinking about mine too, she said. Carl raised an eyebrow slightly. Have you? She nodded. Not as structured as yours, but clearer than before. I'd like to hear it, he said. Tina let out a small breath of preparation, glancing down briefly before looking back up. I used to think loving you meant feeling certain about you, she began. And I do feel that. I always have. Carl didn't interrupt. But I didn't realize that loving you also means choosing you in ways that aren't automatic, she continued. In ways that require attention, and sometimes sacrifice. Carl listened quietly, his posture steady. I promise to think about us before I move through things, she said. Not because I have to, but because I want to build something that includes you by default, not as an addition. Her words came more easily now. I promise not to let my habits decide what matters, she added. I want my choices to reflect that. Carl nodded once, slowly. And, she hesitated briefly, then continued. I promise to make sure you never feel like you're competing for space in my life. The sentence settled between them, not as correction, but as closure. Carl held her gaze. That matters, he said quietly. I know, Tina replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tina smiled faintly, a trace of her old lightness returning, but anchored differently now. I think mine are shorter than yours, she said. Carl smirked slightly. Concise. Efficient, she corrected. He laughed softly. We'll call it intentional. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Do you feel different? She asked. Carl considered the question. Yes, he said. How? She pressed. He looked at her, not searching anymore, not measuring. I don't feel like I'm hoping for something to become clear, he said. I feel like I can already see it. Tina absorbed that, her expression softening again. That's good, she said quietly. It is, he replied. She nodded, then leaned back, her shoulders relaxing fully into the chair. This whole thing started because you weren't sure, she said. Carl nodded once. It did. And now? She asked. He didn't answer immediately, taking just a second to let the truth form without rushing it. Now I'm not wondering where I stand, he said. I know we're building something on purpose. Tina smiled, not wide, not exuberant, but complete. That's all I wanted too, she admitted. Carl closed his laptop slowly, not because he was finished, but because he no longer needed to work through it in that moment. You know, Tina added, tilting her head slightly, this wasn't what I expected engagement to feel like. Carl leaned back in his chair. What did you expect? Something easier, she said honestly. Less introspective. Carl nodded faintly. Same. She smiled. But I don't think easier would have gotten us here, she said. No, Carl agreed. It wouldn't have. She stood then, walking around the table slowly until she reached his side. Her movement wasn't hurried or uncertain. It was deliberate, like everything else had become. Carl looked up at her. Tina rested her hand lightly against his shoulder. Are you done for now? She asked. He glanced at the closed laptop, then back at her. For now, he said. She extended her hand, echoing a gesture that had quietly become familiar. Then come on, she said. Let's do something that isn't about figuring things out. Carl took her hand without hesitation, standing beside her. That sounds like a good plan, he said. She smiled, turning toward the door. As they left the apartment together, there was no sense of something unfinished behind them. Only the quiet certainty of something that was no longer being assumed but chosen.